and thank you for tuning in from wherever you are in the world for this session of Veterans Advanced Energy Week. We hope that you were able to join us for our previous session where expert speakers discussed the role of the Department of Defense in clean energy innovation, as well as our Veterans Advanced Energy Fellowship information session. Just to note, applications do close on August 16th, so please make sure to check out our website to learn how to apply. My name is Maggie Jackson. I'm the Deputy Director for Climate and Advanced Energy at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. And for our veteran audience, I'll also share that I am a former surface warfare officer in the Navy. I'm going to be the moderator for this session, and I'm very pleased to share this virtual stage with a distinguished panel of experts as we discuss the politics of the energy transition. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes. This event is on the record, and we are currently live streaming on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about what you hear today and share on social media using the hashtag VetsEnergyWeek and by tagging us at AC Global Energy and Vets_Energy. If you would like to participate in our conversation, we encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the event. And please note that only those directly engaging through the Veterans Advanced Energy app will be able to submit questions. Now, I would like to turn to our distinguished panel of speakers. Again, I'm delighted to have them here today to discuss geopolitics and the energy transition, because as we all know, the energy transition is picking up at a rapid pace. Countries around the world are setting net zero targets for mid-century and are increasing ambition in the lead up to the next climate conference in Glasgow this November. And as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has shown us in its various reports, the time to act is running out to keep the Earth's temperature rise below 1.5 degrees C. This acceleration of the energy transition will have a tremendous impact on our economic and diplomatic relationships with ally and partner nations and potentially increased tensions with competitor nations. I'm really looking forward to this dynamic discussion. And again, I do want to ask our audience to engage and ask questions. This is a broad topic and we want to make sure we're covering the issues that you're most interested in. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Morgan Bazilian. He is a professor of public policy and director of the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. He's also a part of our advisory council for the Veterans Advanced Energy Project. We have Landon Derez. He's the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe, Eurasia, Africa, and the Middle East with the US Department of Energy, and he's an Air Force veteran. We have Sherry Goodman, board director at the Atlantic Council and former Undersecretary for Environmental Security at the Department of Defense, another advisory council member of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project. We have Julia Neshwa. She's a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council. She recently joined us working on climate change in the Arctic. She's former Homeland Security Advisor to the President and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Energy Resources and an Army veteran. And finally, we have John Smirnow. He's the General Counsel and Vice President of Market Strategy with the Solar Energy Industry Association. It's really great to have you all here with us today. And so without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation. I want to start by asking each panelist, how is the conversation around the geopolitics of energy evolving as we look towards a carbon-constrained world? And in your work, what do you see as the most pressing geopolitical issues as they relate to energy? And Morgan, I'm going to turn to you to start us off.
Maggie, thanks so much for having me on this distinguished panel. It's an honor, and I'm a great fan of the work of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project and honored to sit on the steering committee. We've been working on the issues of the geopolitics of the changing energy and environment landscape for several years. And I'll just give you 5 points, Maggie, of what our work has shown. This is work we've done with various governments and UN agencies. There's 5 points. The first is the point I say for everything, which is humility is needed. And what I mean there is that unintended consequences of policy are rife. And if you don't acknowledge that you will have unintended consequences, then you're not designing programs correctly. We also have a terrible record of predicting the future in the energy sector. That means experts like myself are absolutely horrid at understanding what's going to take place next. So with that said, one of the findings we've had from studying scenarios across the world around the geopolitics of this, in other words, the relationship between sovereign states and non-state actors, is that the pace of change matters. So going too fast is sometimes difficult for governments to keep up. Going too slow doesn't meet our objectives. So it's about finding that middle path, which is never easy. Um, Another outcome we've seen is moving from goals to pathways. And what that means is you referenced that many countries now have long-term goals out to 2050 for climate change. Um, those are relatively easy to come to politically. The hard work is coming up with pathways or detailed plans and funding them at the local levels or the subnational levels. There's going to be winners and losers, and so, or there likely will be winners and losers, and so friction remains between states. It's just going to change. Um, and of course, for the veterans there, the world's militaries and security apparatus need to understand what those changes might look like or guess what those changes might look like so as to be prepared. And the last thing I'll say in this opening salvo is that if we only focus on the what happens in OECD countries or the wealthy countries and do not pay close attention to what's happening in the rest of the world, the bulk of the countries of the world in emerging and developing economies, then we will get this wrong. And I think what we've seen recently with the COVID vaccinations points to this. If we only focus on wealthy countries and getting, say, vaccinations to wealthy countries and not the rest of the world, the fact is that we're hyper interconnected and becoming more interconnected now, and that things like viruses or even climate change won't get addressed appropriately. I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you very much, Morgan. And yes, those are great points, and we certainly want to dig in a little bit deeper. But before that, let me turn to Landon.
Hey, thanks, Maggie. It's great to be here. It's a dynamic topic, so I'm really appreciative to be able to join the discussion. I think Morgan articulated a pretty good outline there that the global community is dealing with a lot. It's got a lot on its plate as we're tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to get our economies to bounce back, and at the same time addressing the climate crisis. And amongst all of that, the clean energy transition and clean energy future is central to our response. So although technology is transforming to tackle the climate challenges, I think the implications of access to reliable and affordable energy and their impact on global economic and political stability obviously remain very germane. It's still a very relevant conversation. People joining us on this call or on this video discussion may be familiar, but President Biden has committed the United States to reducing emissions by 50 to 52% over the next decade. We're working to 100% clean electricity generation by 2035, net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And I raise these targets because they're directly corresponding to our response to those crises up front, the climate crisis and the COVID-19 effort as we bounce back from that, right? To help America tackle the climate crisis and more quickly reach administration goals in net zero, we need these technologies, and doing so will also be creating a lot of jobs and growing the economy. To achieve these goals, we need safe and secure supply chains, I think both in terms of new technology and as well as in accounting for conventional energy resources. We're watching global oil demand bounce back to pre-pandemic levels. So I think that there's just a multifaceted outlook on this. And we need energy systems that are transparent and free of undue political influence. So to answer the bottom line question, when it comes to geopolitical considerations of the energy transition, I think there's a mix of new aspects, the implications of, for example, forced labor on global energy supply chains, especially when they're consolidated into specific countries. I think there's issues of old European energy security, perhaps the geopolitics of Middle East oil, and perhaps hybrid issues as well. Energy choke points in the traditional context of oil and gas trade. We just saw what appears to be in public sources Iranian linked individuals trying to take over a ship, the Asphalt Princess in the Strait of Hormuz last night. So there's conventional aspects, but there's also, those choke points now extend to, I think, new technologies that underpin, or new inputs into technologies that underpin the clean energy transition. So a lot of interesting conversations there as well. I'll go ahead and stop there and look forward to a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Linda. We had Morgan kind of talk a little bit about, okay, we've set these goals. There's a pathway that we need to figure out how to get there. That's something that we know the administration is working on. A lot of very smart people on the Hill are also thinking through this. But as you said, it's not simple because we're still dealing with some of the old issues. And at the end, fundamentally, energy security really is at the core of this too. And certainly in the developed context, but also in the developing context where it's much harder. Sherry, I'd like to go to you next.
Okay, thank you so much, Maggie, and great comments both by Morgan and Landon, really laying out this quite well. So I think let me add to that. There's a lot of ambition climate ambition in the Biden administration's goals here, and all the agencies are working hard to meet the requirements of the executive order, get us ready for COP26. And make the transition towards a clean energy economy. That brings with it still many challenges. And I think we are still in the national security community really just adjusting to how we integrate these climate security concepts of actorless threats into the traditional framework. I think the agencies are working really hard on it. And I think we really need sort of a climate-informed workforce that throughout the federal government, and we're working hard to get there. I think it's a generational effort in some ways. And so I'm pleased to see sort of a new generation coming in to really lead this effort, but it's going to be transformational, and it's going to take a lot of continuous hard work. And it's not just the first 100 days, it's not even the first 2 years. We kind of have to stay on this game because it's going to be easy to fall off it. And the transition to a clean energy economy is hard because, as we already see coming out of COVID, the uptick in fossil fuel demand. And I think that's going to continue. And the challenge is how we get, as was alluded to, how do we get an energy secure world as we transition to a net zero world? And I think we have sort of the big picture of how we should move there. But getting there and then getting the prediction capabilities that we're going to need, both on climate and on energy and a range of global threats, is going to be increasingly challenging. And I think that's going to be, unfortunately, technology will help us with that. But sometimes our institutions are so dispersed that being able to get that big picture without the silos is still, I think, a challenge. So I'm hopeful, and I'm glad to see a diverse set of speakers here on this panel, and to see our veterans really jump into this area, because I think they have so much that they can offer.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We know that you've been working on these issues for a long time, and thank you for laying it out there for us. And I think that question you asked about how do we get an energy secure world and a net zero world is really the crux of what we're getting at here. Now I would like to turn to John. John, I know that you have, I'm sorry, did I skip Julia? Julia, should we go to you? Sorry about that. We're going to switch it up. John, I'm going to come to you because I know that you have extensive experience in solar and renewable energy, and you're looking at this very much through a geopolitical lens because the solar industry really is global, and it really at the core of some of the tensions that we're seeing. So over to you, and maybe you're looking beyond solar. We're interested to hear.
Yeah, definitely beyond solar. I think our message is solar plus. We're a solar advocacy group, but also increasingly focused on the relationship between solar and energy storage, as well as wind and other technologies. The question about what are we looking at, geopolitical considerations, China, forced labor prevention, supply chain, the need for supply chain diversification. But all of this really through the primary lens of how should the United States transition to a more diverse US solar supply chain, a more diverse US energy storage supply chain. We currently have significant gaps in the US solar supply chain. We have a pretty good amount of polysilicon production. That's one of the key inputs used to make solar panels. But the next step in the production process, wafer manufacturing, we have no wafer manufacturing capacity. And if you don't have wafers, you can't make solar cells, which is the key element used to assemble a solar panel. We don't have solar cell production here in the United States. So we really need to figure out how to fill those gaps in the solar supply chain. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is that it's not healthy for our economy to be overly reliant on a small group of suppliers or potentially even a region. You know, we're seeing in Xinjiang, the middle of last year, there was a lot of new solar polysilicon capacity came online in Xinjiang. And we don't want anything to do with that region. So since the fall, we've been calling on the industry to move out of the Xinjiang region. The risks of doing business in that region are just too high. Just by having a business and operating in that region, a company has significant exposure to potential forced labor, human rights violations. So we've been encouraging our industry to move out of that region, giving the industry tools to be able to trace where all the key inputs come from. Customers want to know where the goods they're purchasing were sourced from. The US government wants to know that. But in parallel with that, we really need to make long-term federal investments to grow our solar manufacturing base here in the United States. So we're spending a lot of time with the administration, with members of Congress, and we have a whole suite of federal policy incentives that we think will really help grow solar manufacturing here in the US. So really it's focusing on how does the US transition from older forms of electricity generation to new forms, but it's not a matter of just procuring the technology. We really want to build those supply chains here in the US.
Thank you, John. And certainly the supply chain question is really, really important and something we want to dive into a little bit deeper today. But before that, let me turn to Julia. And John did bring up competition with China, and that's certainly something that's relevant to the work that you do in the Arctic. But very interested to hear how you're thinking about geopolitics of the energy transition. Thank you. Over to you, Julia. Thanks.
Sorry about that little delay there. No, thank you again, Maggie, and thank you to the Atlantic Council. Great to see, you know, an event themed around veterans and the Energy Week. So thank you again. With regards to the conversation and what we're hearing today with the geopolitics of energy, there's no doubt the theme has been on energy transition, and it's, to me, what I've been hearing is it's come to a kind of a crossroads, because you've got, you know, this transition towards a clean energy market, the technology, but yet you're seeing across the globe how it can also, in a positive way, weaken geopolitical rivalries, such as in the Middle East, for example. We're seeing increased cooperation and actually decreased competition in some ways, beginning to see this significant shift in the drivers of geopolitics altogether. I mean, you think about centers of energy production that are thinking of relocating away from oil and gas rich states these days. I currently serve as a commissioner also on the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, which is a presidential commission that reports to Congress and the White House. And so within those realms, we're also seeing that on the flip side, there is this existence of a resource-driven conflict that continues to persist with states and businesses that are fighting, if anything, over rare earth minerals that, of course, are essential for green energy technology, clean energy technology. You know, I'm seeing it in the Arctic region. You look at Russia and China right now with the competition out there. We're seeing much more traffic in shipping and mining and so forth. So we're also seeing this eventual decline of oil and gas revenues that could also affect states becoming more fragile that certainly host resource-focused economies. And again, there's this realization that those who fail to adjust or diversify, they'll start to see these significant economic collapses as their revenue streams start to dry up. Seeing a lot of trends, of course, that are creating this momentum for this global energy transformation, with the uptick of renewable energy, for example, and wind and solar and other renewables. It's taken place mostly we've seen in the electricity sector. Certainly those new technologies are enabling this transformation in other sectors. But as I think about the Arctic, for example, we've got more development and interest in electric vehicles and heat pumps that are extending the deployment for renewables. So mainly that's transport and industry and buildings. So it's certainly a lot of great opportunity right now in that world. And then I can certainly go on too about innovations in energy storage, and that expansion is certainly needed, and that potential, especially in the renewable sector, is looking to flourish, which is so different from decades ago. So great to see some of that happening in this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you for bringing in some of those examples from the Middle East as well. I feel like we've really covered the globe now with some of the examples we've talked about. But I think what the best thing to do is, because again, this is so broad, is to really narrow this down and start with one of, again, the topic areas that's front and center. And coming out of the pandemic, we really saw that there's not a lot of transparency in our current supply chain. And John brought up some of the human rights issues. So Landon, I'd like to start with you as we're coming out of the pandemic and reflecting on some of the things that it brought to light. What are the risks and vulnerabilities that you see that are associated with the current clean energy supply chain?
I look forward to John's comments on these too, because he outlined some pretty sophisticated outlooks on the clean energy supply chain. But what I would tell you is, if the climate crisis is a priority, which it is for this administration, then clean energy supply chains and value chains are going to matter extensively. But we're weighing that with our value-driven foreign policy, and I don't think one should come at the expense of the other. So you're asking about risks and vulnerabilities, but let me say, this is also leading to some pretty fantastic partnerships and new thinking that really is materializing. I think maybe the most crisply in the G7, among G7 partner countries, as we look to think about issues of supply chain security, financing, the impact on the geopolitical landscape and on the stability of for example, oil producing countries and the revenue stream that they rely on. So if I was really to hone in on this from a US perspective, I think it can't be, it's unquestionable that China has a extensive it dominates the global solar supply chain. And so I think you see a lot of consideration about what that means and how do we diversify that supply chain. I've heard, friend shoring. I think that's the term, but bringing in a consortium of countries that are like-minded, that have our values, that can deploy these technologies in an economic fashion, and ensure that the clean energy transition is not disrupted. I think the other aspect, it's not just the technologies, it's not just the inputs, it's also making sure that we find ways to adequately finance these projects globally, both in terms of deploying ready-made technology, but also putting funding into R&D so that we're ready for next generation technology as well. You're seeing that extensively, especially the latter end at the Department of Energy, where the Secretary has announced what we're calling Earth shots. So far, we've announced one or two actually, but one on hydrogen, focused on declining the price of hydrogen by 90% in the next decade, another on long duration storage and batteries. And I think, an underpinning of those conversations and the R&D that's going into those processes is also going to be about the supply chains. And while we're doing that, and while the Department of Energy is focused on issues of next generation technology and making sure we're adequately funding those technologies, I think you're seeing resources like the Development Finance Corporation be creative in terms of its efforts to deploy technologies today. So I think those are two areas, the monopolization of the supply chain, the financing of the supply chain. And then I just say there is a very, and it's been raised, a very material impact on spheres of influence, on geopolitical landscape. You know, we over the last 4 years, or last 10 years, we've touted the shale revolution and kind of the conventional surge of energy domestically in the United States. But those kind of events, like I anticipate the clean energy transition to do, have an impact on the landscape and the economic relationships that underpin the world as we know it today. And so, you know, you take a place like the Middle East, where I think a lot of our veterans that are watching today are familiar kind of with some of the economic consequences and revenue streams and how that drives the dynamics of the region. And you realize that, you know, there used to be kind of this symbiotic relationship where America in 2004, for example, was importing a ton of oil, 12 million barrels a day. Now we're relatively flush. What's that do? It changes where people look and how they approach the economic relationships globally, right? With the Middle East looking towards East Asia. And I think I only bring that up in a conversation of clean energy transitions and supply chains, because it is a risk that we need to be aware of as we're pursuing new technologies as well. There's a lot of parallels and linkages there. So that's a little bit of how we're approaching this in the US government, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think as we look at what's happening on the Hill, potential legislation, the priorities of your department and others, building up a domestic manufacturing base, kind of as John alluded to before, whether it's in solar or other technologies, but certainly in innovation, that translates directly to then how we can engage in economic relationships as countries are trying to meet their clean energy targets and potentially compete in a way we haven't done before, whether it's through trade or through finance or some of the areas that you mentioned. So on that note, I'd like to turn to Sherry, and again, if any of the other panelists would like to jump on this as well. Are the measures that the US is taking right now, some of what Landon discussed, some of the Biden administration's policies and potential legislation? When I think about legislation, I'm looking at the US Innovation and Competition Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, potential other legislation that's coming down the line. Is this the right direction in terms of building US competitiveness, and how do you see that playing out in some of these areas that we're talking about as they relate to geopolitics?
Well, thanks, Maggie, and Landon, again, great comments. I do think that in the infrastructure bill that's pending right now, particularly this new energy infrastructure resilience framework, and as well as the state energy security plans and the PROTECT Act and various other provisions in there, are designed to improve our energy security while moving us towards those net zero and clean energy goals. The grid modernization provisions, and the extensive transportation provisions, also measures to support carbon capture, utilization, sequestration technologies to enhance energy efficiency of building, facilitate and expedite electric transmission, and even in remote move to clean energy in remote areas like in the Arctic that Julian discussed, which also tee off a lot of experiences that our military had during the decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, learning how vulnerable our supply chain of energy is when we're trying to truck fuels to the front, and how vulnerable our soldiers and Marines were in those positions. So, you know, we learned the hard way, and there was a focus on energy innovation during those wars for our military. Now we can apply some of those same tools in our toolkit as we seek to transition both our military and the rest of our economy into a lower carbon future. And the military, I think here, can lead by example, and is also looking at its supply chains. You know, back when I served in the Department of Defense as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, I recall we had the stockpiles of critical materials. At that time, in the 1990s, it even included things like mercury that we were actually trying to get rid of, that we couldn't get rid of because they were so toxic. On the other hand, now we need new stockpiles of new materials like lithium and cobalt, and we need to sort of look across the whole dimension, all the elements of the supply chain, from the mining of the materials and how we do that in a sustainable way, and reignite, sustainable mining in the US, which has its own direct challenges, or secure those supply chains. And then at the same time, look across the whole long chain of manufacturing and cell production. I mean, John talked compellingly about how difficult that is in the solar industry. So the national security community can help with some of that, where there's an overlap between the military mission needs and the general US and commercial supply chain needs. And that's where you could get sort of a triple win. You can improve energy security in the military, you can improve our national security, and you can help sort of use the buying power of the military. That won't be true for necessarily every single material, but it's going to be true in enough cases. Electrification of the vehicle fleet is one, and certainly some of the key elements in the clean energy suite are some of those that we should really be pushing hard on that. And I know that the Defense Department is doing that, and I know that the Biden administration's executive orders on the supply chain target both the energy resilient and clean energy supply chain, and then try to take advantage of where there's overlap with the military mission need.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And just to pick up on that, I see John has his hand raised. I think I'll go to John and then Julia to chime in here. And I think, John, for you, China has such dominance in the solar supply chain, and you talked about some of the reasons and some of the specific areas such as wafers. And I know there's been some proposed legislation that's talking about bringing that back. How quickly do you think we can bring that or build a domestic industry here in order to actually be able to provide not only for our domestic demand, but also perhaps demand rising in other countries as well? And I think you had other comments, so feel free to answer some of that, to comment on the last.
It's good. My comments fit right into that. It's going to take a decade of a commitment by the federal government that we've never seen in at least our generation. China committed to build a broad solar manufacturing base, and it provided a suite of options. And that's what we need. We need, I know sometimes people don't like to say this, but we need an industrial policy. In the past for manufacturing, we had one-off investments. During the Recovery Act, in the Obama administration, we had a manufacturing tax credit. We had some loan guarantees. We saw investments, we saw facilities build up, but it wasn't enough to sustain an industry while the industry scales. And in our case, we have significant gaps in the solar supply chain. And so we really need to focus on three things. We need to focus on demand drivers, demand incentive. For us, that's a long-term extension of the solar investment tax credit. That's one part of the three-legged stool. The second part is we need capital support. We need federal investments like a 48C manufacturing tax credit, because the private sector, we're competing as a country for private sector investments. Companies are looking to build a factory in India, Vietnam, Malaysia, or the United States. So you need that CapEx support as well. Then the third piece, as we grow the industry, first and foremost, you have to fill the gaps in the primary solar supply chain. We need wafer capacity. 95% of wafers are currently made in China. We want to grow that space. Cell manufacturing, as well as inverters. We only have now a single US inverter manufacturer. So immediately focus on standing up companies in that space, but then all of the supporting industries, solar panel manufacturing. We don't make much solar glass in the United States. We don't make solar junction boxes. And so while you are standing up the primary parts of the solar supply chain, you need ongoing production support until those supporting industries scale. That's the third piece, the ongoing domestic production support. Senator Ossoff has a proposal where if you manufacture solar equipment in the US, you get a tax credit for what you sell. But you need all three of those pieces. If you're missing one of those gaps, it's going to be difficult to grow that solar supply chain, but it's going to take time. It's going to take really a decade of a committed, broad suite of federal policy options.
Thank you very, very much, John. And Julia, I saw that you wanted to jump in. I don't know if I imagine it's probably not a follow-on, but a comment on the earlier discussion over
Yeah,
here.
just Thank you. Just to get back, yeah, with your question with regard to the Biden administration and the policies at this point and the challenges. I mean, well, first of all, as Sherry said, I mean, domestically, it's great to see the bipartisan infrastructure bill, you know, especially to help with the funding piece of this and the resiliency aspect of it. But I just wanted to throw out that it's also important that we take a more realistic look at our targets and what we're seeing. We heard China earlier, you know, the net zero target that started with China last September, of course, China being the number one emitter in the world, was a pretty big deal. And so followed by the number two emitter with the Biden administration also having a net zero by 2050 target. So in addition to that, I mean, we just have to consider, and I think as John was saying, there are several other actors on the stage who've been really forceful the past couple of years. And that's definitely the business and the financial sector. As he said earlier, changing the energy systems can take decades and sometimes even more than that. Back just the past year, demand for all energy sources, oil, gas, coal, has actually increased. And in some cases, even pre-COVID levels and emissions have also gone up significantly. So it's a long journey, basically, and it's not going to be that straightforward. So I think taking a phased approach, and I like the idea of having some sort of industrial policy. I think that could certainly be very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. And I've even heard, you know, sometimes we say reshoring, but we have to be honest with ourselves and say there might not have been an industry before. So really this is about building up our industrial base in new technologies. And on that note, Morgan, I'd like to turn to you because I know you have thoughts on this. And I was wondering if you could speak to maybe some of the other sectors such as critical minerals or electric vehicles that I know that you've looked at extensively. And then we are getting some audience questions in, so I'll turn to those next.
Sure. Thanks, Maggie. And I just wanted to, before I do that, just follow up on one thing that Sherry said. I always learn a lot from her. And about a year ago, we wrote something where we thought we coined the term actorless threats. And like everything, I'm sure that Sherry had coined it before us. But what we said there, and I think it's important for your audience or this veterans audience today, is that climate change and the COVID pandemic are highlighting key weaknesses in US national security strategy and policy. That's not just US, it's other countries as well. And we call those actorless threats, and addressing those issues not just require making traditional national security agencies more climate or pandemic aware, but actually reimagining the concept of national security itself. And that could mean anything from changing the focus of troop deployments to altering the missions of forward and domestic bases, refocusing military R&D spending, and even refining officer education at the academies. So I just wanted to touch on that concept of actorless threats because it's a really important one as you're discussing geopolitics of these energy transitions, because the threats themselves are fundamentally changing. And then just really briefly on the supply chain issues, you've had some great comments. Look, considering supply chains are complex, and I don't say that to be trite. I say that because that's the opening line for any discussion or legislation, and then it sort of immediately turns to something more simplistic. So if we think about, say, critical minerals as we call them in the United States and elsewhere, there's lists in Japan, European Union, Australia, Canada, et cetera. Each one of those 35 minerals has its own supply chain, and most are small markets, if markets at all, and they're not transparent. Many of them are, you actually don't know who's dominating this the supply chain, although, as we've said, China has a lot of that. But keep in mind also that China's aware that advanced manufacturing, or the downstream part of the supply chain, has much higher value add to an economy than the rocks themselves. In other words, having advanced manufacturing for solar or for batteries or for space defense or those kind of things has a much higher value. And you can see that's actually in most places where China's domination is in that part. Interestingly, of course, the mining part tends to take the longest to get started. But the way we think about criticality, that's the term we use, critical, it really is akin to how we used to think about energy security in the 1970s and 80s, around the time of the Carter Doctrine. And so that methodology means, it's supply focused, and we worry about import dependence. In other words, where do we get it from, and do we like them, and how much do we get it from them? That's a fairly outdated and not very sophisticated way to think about security. And so for these supply chains, from solar energy to batteries to minerals like copper or lithium, we really do need to employ some of these more sophisticated ways to think about security, or criticality, as you like, so that policy can be more nuanced and effective.
Thank you very much, Morgan, and thank you for underlining the fact that the threats are fundamentally changing. I think that that's something we definitely want to underline for our audience here. And it's been great to see really DoD and Secretary Austin at the forefront of talking about how climate change is redefining or is so important to national security, but really redefining the operating environment. I'd like to turn to one of the questions from the audience and maybe frame it a little bit differently, but the question from Nick says, are there any examples of a reverse engineering approach to addressing greenhouse gas emissions reductions? And really what he means by that, I think, is a bottom-up approach, starting with identifying local needs and addressing them in phases, as opposed to these long-term goals. So maybe we could start with why long-term goals are important, and then what is important from maybe a social innovation approach. And I think relating this back to the geopolitical conversation, when we were talking about potential winners and losers, the winners of this century are going to be the countries that are participating and innovating in clean energy technologies and gaining market share. And right now we know that China is at the forefront of that US is investing millions of dollars in this field. But how do we also uplift other countries and help foster local innovation ecosystems so that they can thrive, and that they're not also tethered to fossil fuels in their transition as the base of their economy? And I know that, Morgan, we had talked a little bit about this before, but would anyone like to jump in? Anyone?
Hey, Maggie,
Landon?
I'll
Okay,
jump in
thank
really
you.
quick.
Go ahead.
No, I think the question from Nick is really salient, but I think when you look at forecasting what is required to meet the clean energy transition, the scale of that transformation is massive. So there's a strong apparatus out there to answer your question, Nick. And I think groups like, there's a huge NGO apparatus, USAID. We spend tons of money on development finance annually and foreign aid to help, I think, on very acute localized issues, not explicitly always in the energy space, but including in the energy space, which, as we've talked about today, climate and energy at this point are intertwined, and you can't really divorce those issues. So I think people are looking at this at a very a micro level. I think the question is, when you see the International Energy Agency put out, what it takes to achieve net zero 2050, and one of presumably what we'll see is many scenarios in the coming years on how to achieve that feat. I think we have to be talking about scale. We have to be talking about massive deployment of clean energy technologies at a rate at which we haven't experienced before. And so I think the reason why you see that pivot and the focus on very big top-down efforts is because of just that issue, in terms of the expectation of governments to respond to the climate crisis sufficiently to achieve the outcome. So I think you'll see a very robust effort at the localized level as well, and I don't anticipate that stopping anytime soon. And I think to Morgan's point, there is increasing fidelity and localized appreciation of problem sets throughout the world, and having a much more sophisticated, if not incrementally more sophisticated, but still becoming more sophisticated in how we address these issues. So be heartened on one hand that is being thought of, and we do have and will continue to fund that apparatus. But I do want to underscore just the monumental task we have in front of us to achieve the net zero ambitions that the world's kind of headed on now. So.
Thank you, Landon, and thank you for that question. Did anyone else want to chime in? Otherwise, I can launch us on to the next topic
Maggie,
area. John, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick thought. I mean, it's not localization, but I was on a U.S. Department of Commerce advisory panel for 5 or 6 years, and it was focused on export promotion. One thing we realized is that you first have to be strong at home before you can focus on exports. And if you don't have a strong manufacturing base, it's going to be difficult to then help your allies stand up on their own bases. So I think we put out a manufacturing white paper, and one element of working with our overseas allies is to first build the manufacturing base at home, and then we can work with them on helping them stand up those industries as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, John. And certainly there's a role in capacity building and eventually technology transfer and things like that. But I
Let's not forget,
for example.
Yeah, Maggie, let's also not forget the importance of improving our resilience against the ongoing climate risks that we face today and will continue to face for the foreseeable future. Of course, the Atlantic Council has a whole resilience center, Adrian Arsh Rockefeller Resilience Center, focused, I know, specifically on the extreme heat risks, which are so paramount and important for human security here at home and globally. And as we transition to clean energy, we have to, at the same time, make that energy infrastructure and our total human and built and natural infrastructure all more resilient against the climate threat multipliers that are continuing to challenge us every day, from heat, sea level rise, wildfire, permafrost collapse. You know, we could do Julie and I could do a whole deep dive on what that means for Russia and the Arctic, as well as you know, extreme weather events and the like. So I think that's ocean acidification. So we have to be able to walk and chew gum here. We're going to have to become resilient to the existing climate risks that are already baked into our Earth system, and at the same time make that monumental energy transition and make ourselves resilient and avoid the best we can avoid the unintended consequences of that transition as we make that net zero shift.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And I think, you know, kind of going back to what John was saying before, we have a lot to learn at home. And then we have a lot, then we can work with partners around the world and helping them build their resilience. And I know that we are actively working to build that into our foreign policy approach. And I can't think of anyone more qualified than Julia to maybe make a few comments on this topic of whether it's improving resilience at home and how that translates, or as Sherry was briefly mentioning, you know, as this relates to the Arctic, which is, you know, certainly, you know, the foremost example of where some of the biggest climate impacts already are. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Maggie. Absolutely. Yeah, as a former chief resilience officer for the state of Florida as well, and then even working in the White House and covering the resilience portfolio, we had nonstop hurricane seasons, wildfires out west, in addition to dealing with the pandemic. But the lesson there, I think, as we know, especially as we think about our energy systems, our grid infrastructure, whether you're dealing with a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, we have to build back stronger. Not to take slogans away or anything like that, but it's just essential. I mean, economically, environmentally, I mean, there are reasons why we have to really plan better when it comes to that. So it's great to see at the local state level, as we deal with climate change and extreme heat, as well as extreme cold in the Arctic, we have to take those measures into play when it comes to becoming more resilient, particularly in our energy systems. I'm happy to go a little bit more into what we're doing in the Arctic region, if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be great. And I think one of the questions I had outlined for you, just based on what you had recently published with us, was also how, as you saw the Arctic as a renewable energy frontier, which I thought was really interesting and not something I've heard a lot about. So please, yeah, if you want to take a minute or two, and then we'll have to wrap up in a little bit. Go ahead.
Certainly. No, it's absolutely an exciting time. Again, I know as average Americans or just across the world, it's still a conundrum of why does the Arctic even matter? What are we doing up there? But when it comes to national security issues, when it comes to our fisheries, trade, shipping routes, and so forth, there's certainly a nexus, in particular in the energy transition world. Right now, communities in the Arctic are absolutely seeking energy security. Replacing fossil fuels with alternatives has certainly now become a priority. A lot of the Arctic nations recognize that improved energy efficiency, for example, as well as renewable energy technologies, will certainly help achieve some of the socioeconomic development goals, as well as trying to support environmental health as and overall security writ large. So as we speak, research is being conducted. I just did a trip up there a couple months ago on battery and other storage methods for renewables, particularly as it looks to under extreme cold or harsh conditions. I was up there with a special forces group, and they were conducting a military exercise. We even had representatives from Space Force, and just to be able to set up satellite dishes. I mean, the cables were freezing, so it was a good exercise to learn what you can do, because everything is certainly a lot slower and much more delayed. But at the end of the day, especially for the Arctic nations, I mean, they're looking to try to optimize and increase the efficiency systems. Whether that's to just reduce oil consumption overall for heating. But a lot of progress is happening, and with the commission that I'm on, we even have an Arctic Renewable Energy Working Group that helps to serve Arctic communities to try to address a lot of the rural heating and electrification issues. In fact, a lot of Alaskan communities right now are starting to use more renewable energy. I think there was about 25 local villages that have now employed wind turbines just to generate power. We're seeing an interest now more in biomass resources as well. And then finally, I just say it's great to see other Arctic nations such as Iceland achieve close to 100% renewables by using geothermal. So that's another area where we're seeing a lot more development, particularly on the home front. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And thank you for sharing a little bit of personal anecdotes about your recent time up there. We only have about 10 minutes left, and I want to get back to the workforce development piece of this conversation and hear a little bit from Landon about his story, and Morgan and Sherry as our advisory board members to talk a little bit, again, with a kind of call to action for our veterans. But we had a good question come in that I think John is, again, the perfect person to speak to. And it's about the role of lobbying for renewable energy on the Hill. And maybe you could speak to that and some of the efforts within your industry association, and how effective you think that is, and again, pushing this agenda.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest contributor to the success of the solar industry lobbying has been having a new president. I think that's singularly the most important thing that's happened, which is great. But yeah, I mean, we are a growing industry. We're a sizable industry, but still quite young. And the importance of lobbying, I think, we're still doing a lot of education to convince our members of the industry. Our members certainly get it, but the industry of the importance of lobbying. That's been a challenge. The oil and gas industry, massive resources there, but we're successful. We've been successful. We recently were able to get an extension of our investment tax credit. All of our key federal policy asks are seriously in play in a reconciliation package. Grassroots solar is in every state in the country. Lots of small, medium-sized enterprises there. So lots of room to grow in the solar industry and solar advocacy. But I think right now we're kind of the small engine that could story. And hopefully if we get to a reconciliation package, there's going to be some really good investments, long-term federal investments there for renewable energy broadly.
And maybe just a follow-up question to transition to the workforce development piece, but what has your experience been with whether it's, so we actually have an event with Solar Ready that's tomorrow, which we're really excited about. But as you see the solar development, you've been in this space for many years, as you've seen it grow in the US and as you look to the future, what opportunities do you see for, what do we need in terms of workforce development, and what opportunities do you see for employment moving forward, specifically in the solar industry?
Yeah, so we do participate in the Solar Ready Vets. We have a full-time CS staffer that is committed to that, and lots of opportunities for vets to go into the solar industry and all segments of the solar industry. You know, it's the one thing about solar is that there are jobs in you know, procurement, moving goods around. There are management jobs. There are electrical jobs. So I think we've had a lot of success and a lot of participation from some of our leading companies in the industry, and I think that's going to continue to grow.
Thank you. And I just want to underline the mission of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project before turning it over to the rest of our panelists, which is the fact that the clean energy transition and working in the clean energy space is kind of another mission that veterans can set their sights on as they transition out of active duty military service. And it really, as we've talked about, comes back to supporting national security in a really important way and U.S. economic competitiveness. So with that in mind, Landon, I'd like to go to you first for closing comments, just to talk a little bit about your experience as a veteran and why you see this is so important.
Thanks, Maggie, and thanks for a really great conversation today. What I would tell you is I feel that veterans are uniquely situated, often from very personal experience with the impacts of energy supply chains at a very human and personal level. I think Sherry might have referenced earlier logistics and casualties from conflicts around the world because of logistics supply chains makes, I think, many veterans very in tune with the implications of tactical implications of energy. But I also think that there's a deep appreciation for strategic thinking within the military as well, and exposure to a broad slate of countries and environments where we can appreciate the political and economic consequence of energy policy around the world. I think it's really important that veterans make a very deliberate decision to extend themselves not only to the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, but also institutions like the Department of Energy, where we're thinking through the technologies that are going to be responsive to the challenges of the future. And so I really encourage a diversified consideration, as people are potentially contemplating careers, whether it's in the private sector or government, to pursue energy as an avenue, because the clean energy transition is going to modernize how we deal with policy globally. But I don't think that those debates and consequences are going to disappear. So hopefully this conversation can motivate some individuals to take this route as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Landon. Morgan, do you have any closing thoughts for the group?
Thanks, Maggie. Just to say that it's a terribly dynamic industry to go into, and I think that the skill sets that some of the veterans have make it a really exciting one. And anything where you can see growth and possibly nonlinear growth, especially for younger people, is exciting and hopefully making a useful difference. And the last thing I'd say is the project, the Veterans Advanced Energy Project, is doing a terrific job in this space. And do keep in mind that while we're talking about veterans from the United States, that this is a global change and a global transition, and some of their experiences overseas and understanding that the United States is not alone in the world will be really useful for context and that humility I started my conversation with.
Thank you so much, Morgan. And again, talking about veterans who have experience, Julia, over to you if you have any closing thoughts.
Yes, thank you so much. With my military career, I mean, if it wasn't for that platform, I think I wouldn't be where I am today and in the energy world. I was deployed after 9/11, served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it dawned on me when I was out there, particularly throughout the country of Iraq, where you've had, whether it's in a tactical area where there's no running water, there's power outages, how can you focus on security and counterterrorism issues if you don't have the basics of your energy resources? I saw how the lack of electricity was fueling the insurgency, how the fights between the ministers over oil share revenues when I was liaisoning with them and so forth. So it really, brought to my attention the need of how there's such a nexus when it comes to energy and all these other areas. And for those who are looking to make that transition, I'd also encourage the civil service as well. They have veterans preference. I came from the State Department working at the Energy Resources Bureau. There's obviously the Department of Energy and so many other entities as well, in addition to the private sector. So something to consider. And if anybody wants to reach out for some of those thoughts offline, I'm happy to do so. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for underlining those opportunities. And Sherry, I'm going to turn to you for the final word. I know you've said a little bit on this already, but we really appreciate you being here today. I'll give the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Maggie, and thank you for putting together an excellent panel, very diverse and including many veterans and others who are committed, of course, to the mission of public service. And what I'd say to all our veteran listeners and participants is, you join the military, or we joined in the civilian capacity because of our mission orientation. And now this is another mission. This is a national and a global mission we're on now to decarbonize our economies and to reduce climate risk globally, at home and abroad. And that is going to be the shaping force, really, for our future. And so any ways that you can contribute through the talents that you've gained, because the military brings, once you're trained in the military, you bring so many great professional skills to anything that you can do, whether it's in John's solar industry, whether it's in wind, whether it's in grid modernization, electrification, across the board. There's so many opportunities now, even in the new fields of climate risk analytics, which is going to be a growing field, converging AI and other technologies, advanced technologies. So I think there are many opportunities here, and they're all mission driven. And I'm very proud to be affiliated with this effort of the Atlantic Council on Veterans Advanced Energy. Of course, Dan Mish, a former veteran, DOE employee, was a co-founder along with Greg Duque, good friend as well, for Marine. And Maggie, you're the perfect person to help finish this out. So thank you for your service, and to all my fellow panelists, appreciate spending this time with you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Sherry. That was such a great note to end on. Again, I want to extend my thanks to this fantastic panel. We covered a lot in only an hour, so I really appreciate everything that you shared with this group today. So to the audience, thank you so much for joining us for this important and productive conversation. And again, thank you to our speakers. If you'd like to rewatch today's event or share the stream with colleagues, a catch replay will be available on the Atlantic Council YouTube channel and on our social media platforms. I want to highlight that coming up next in our conference program at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, please join us for a screening of the film Nation in Transition. That will be in partnership with the American Resilience Project, which will highlight stories of the energy transition on tribal lands in the Navajo Nation. And we'll also have an expert panel featuring Indigenous leaders as well as the film's director. And I'm really excited, and I hope you'll join us. We've always loved partnering with the American Resilience Project, and the films are fantastic, and I always learn a lot. Thank you again. I hope to see you there, and take care and stay safe. Thank you.